Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. This is the first time in Warsaw, in Poland. My first time at an ICA SBA conference. The last time I presented, or I sent in a proposal, and I was very excited to come here. Unfortunately, neither you nor I could make it because that was the COVID year. So very happy to be here. So just a little bit of introduction. I'm not part of any company per se. I run my own heritage and archiving company. We do a bunch of things, but today I'm here to speak to you about, or rather to take you through one of our projects. It's very close to me. Personally, I spent about 2 or 3 years just documenting the history of this company. This is a 100-year-old tiling company. And taking the broader theme of this conference further, it's essentially a story of resilience and of how this 100-year-old company has survived. So the company is called Bharat Flooring Tiles. Today it's known as BFT. At one point of time it was known as Bharat Tiles and Marble. I'll tell you when the marble comes in, why it comes in, and so on. But I am going to constantly be using either Bharat or BFT very interchangeably, so you'll probably have to keep track of that. Essentially, when the Bharat story, why is that important? Of course, it's important because, like I said, a 100-year-old company. We have several points in its history where it's had to adapt. It's had to diversify. But more importantly, especially in the case of Bharat, it is this balance that they've been able to maintain with balance between tradition and modernity. It becomes more striking in the last 25 years, but that balance is something that one sees throughout their 100 years. Before we deep dive into what exactly we did, this is just an overview of what Bharat goes through. 1922, it is set up in the spirit of Swadeshi. Swadeshi means economic independence, the ability to make yourself, right? That was 1922 is peak freedom movement in India. Gandhi has come into the picture. You have all of this talk of economic independence, political independence, that we need to start becoming self-reliant, and it's in that spirit that Bharat is set up. Goes really well for a couple of decades. 20s to 50s is their glory period. The map that you see on this side is something that we prepared as a result of our research. And that is basically the glory period of Bharat. You'll see some of the most iconic Bombay structures. That's the map of Bombay. Iconic Bombay structures still standing, the Metro Cinema, the Reserve Bank of India building. All of these were tiled by Bharat during this glory period. Unfortunately, 60s to 90s, you have 3 or 4 straight decades of losses. And that's where the resilience story comes in, and I'll probably be able to touch upon how is it that Bharat is able to survive this period. So much so that post-99, when they are able to revive themselves, how the table has turned for them and how they're today a very, very dynamic brand that has been able to connect with a very, very younger audience, although it is a 100-year-old brand. But what was Bharat like when we started? So BFT at 100, a boutique company. It's into designer tiles, not mass-produced tiles. So therefore, it's looking at, the orders that they get are typically very small orders. The volumes are small. So therefore, if you look at it from the turnover point of view, they are a very, very small company. They're a boutique company, a niche company. But the brief that we got was that we need to sell the legacy. We need to sell the fact that they have a certain expertise in their material, in their market, and that they were a bespoke brand. It started in Bombay, has always been a Bombay brand. Everybody in Bombay knows the family, knows the brand, knows the structures. But now they are expanding into the rest of the country, and there they don't have their history to sell. Right? They don't have that, that resonance with the brand is not there. So that was a challenge, and we had to figure out how do we say a slightly more pan-India story. In the last 25 years, they've been able to rework their business model. So you see a whole lot of collaboration, so which means just apart from the family, senior management, workers, there are various other stakeholders that have come into Bharat. You have designers, you have architects, you have a supply chain. All of these sort of now made for a very, very interesting story, and that's something that we wanted to fold into the entire 100-year exercise. At the end of the day, Bharat has to deal with cement, with powdered cement, which is a very, very whimsical product. And a lot of their limitations in product expansion, innovation, stems from the fact that they have to deal with cement, and they have always dealt with cement. In the previous slide, I showed you some steps of production. Two things haven't changed in Bharat. They've not diversified into other raw materials, so it's still cement, and they've not changed the way their production is done. The same machinery, the same steps that were introduced in 1922 is the process that they still follow. They've just not been able to modernize. Things for them to think about, but for someone who's looking at heritage marketing, I thought that was beautiful. Lastly, Bharat typically focuses on architects and designers as their client base, but we wanted to change that because there is this much of storytelling that I can do with architects, but the moment you turn that around and make Bharat look like a B2C company that is directly connected to its customers, it became a far more dynamic story. And interestingly, while we were searching, while we were doing our research, we were able to actually go out and speak to homeowners, understand why they picked a design, why they picked a color, and what was going through their head. So that's the kind of storytelling that we had to do. And unfortunately, we had to do all of this in the middle of COVID. So therefore, the kind of solutions that we came up with, and I'm not going to go into the campaign per se today, but it had to keep in mind that this is going to be a largely digital exercise. But when we started out, what did we have in terms of an archive? We didn't have much. We had Mrs. Dilawaz Varyava, that's the founder's daughter, who had a cupboard and a drawer where all the material was kept, but sadly the archive ended in the 1950s. Even this archive was limited because there was just marketing literature. So there was the oldest product brochure, there were testimonials, and there was anything that her father and her uncle thought necessary for from the point of view of marketing at that point. The archive hadn't. The archive did not reflect anything beyond the 1950s. We had information of what the product was, what some of the projects were, but we had zero photographs. And this, the problem was we were doing a digital campaign, and Bharat does its marketing only through social media. They literally don't, like I said, they're a very small company. They don't spend anything on marketing other than social media, Instagram, that too just Instagram, so which means I needed pictures. I needed pictures to be able to do the storytelling, and there was no pictures. Finally, there are quite a few old brands in India. There are quite a few founders who are respectable, who've been, made heroes of. But sadly, the Bharat family, that is the Sidhwa Varyava family, is not part of that conversation. Right? So nobody really talks about the founder as, one of those great industrialists who started a brand, a much-loved brand that is 100 years old. So we also wanted to make sure that the people, the founder stories and things like that, that's a correction that we wanted to do in the Bharat narrative. So apart from the limited archive, what we immediately understood was that we were dealing with close to 500 design patterns that Bharat had over the years. Plus, they were into customized products, like I said, bespoke. Not just that. They could manufacture tiles in 30 different colors. And if you came up to them and said, I want a specific shade of mauve, they would try and do that for you as well. Which means I had so many stories to say. If you do the math, there are tons of stories, tons of projects. We had to do that selection as to what is it? What is the story that we are going to say? we first began with sort of expanding the archive, including these story points that we knew were missing, including these angles that we knew were missing. Fortunately for us, back in the 30s and 40s, the English press in Bombay, especially the Times of India and the Journal of Indian Institutes of Architects, they did critical pieces on, in fact, they had an entire supplement on construction in the city, and they had review pieces on new structures coming up. They reviewed it from the point of view of usage, from the point of view of design and everything. So we got a lot of sort of, commentary on what was happening in the city thanks to these resources. Like I said, I had to go and look for photographs. I don't know if the HSBC archivist is over here, but we did manage to source photographs from that archive. We realized that the building comes up in 1950s. We realized it was there in one of their brochures, got in touch with them, and we got these wonderful photographs from their archive. Of course, we had to we do in most of our projects, we do a lot of oral history interviews. It's pretty extensive, close to about 30, 40 interviews in every project. So this is something that we did over here as well. But we spend months just going through what is called the Salesforce software, which is something that the sales team uses today, and they've been using it from, I think, about 2008 onwards. So which gave me access to all customers' projects from 2008 onwards. I've spent weeks just going through this software, reading material, understanding what was the thought behind every project, trying to select where there is a story, sometimes snooping, getting phone numbers from this platform, reaching out to end customers, checking if they'd be okay with an interview and things like that. So that's been how we've gone about building the archive. And finally, we come to what is it that we did. So like I said, potentially, I had a lot of stories. We were also, this was also because Bharat was turning 100 in 2022. So we realized, why not do this? Why not do, I'm sure some of you have done similar campaigns. It's not the most original idea. So we went ahead with a campaign called 100 Years, 100 Stories. Apart from the fact that I knew I was sitting on a lot of content, it was also, my inspiration also came from the fact that any Bharat tile, any design, can be played around with thanks to the colors and thanks to the fact that you can interpret it in your home or your office space the way you want. By just simply placing the tile in a completely different way, it gives you an entirely new floor. And so I thought that, yes, that variation needs to come in, that complexity needs to come in into our storytelling. So the 100 Years, 100 Stories, therefore, touched upon various themes. We, of course, spoke about the early years because that storyline had to be communicated. Like I said, we went a little, we took a step back from gorgeous architectural magazine photographs of beautiful, luxurious spaces, and we said, let's center stage the people. So we tried to say a lot of stories about the people behind Bharat. We looked at some iconic projects. We looked at those instances in their history, and there have been many, where they've had to pivot. Otherwise, they would have to fold up. But then we also looked at the new Bharat because, again, we're speaking to an Instagram generation today. So we also had to give them stories about themselves, stories that would resonate with a 20-year-old, 25-year-old. So these were some of the things that we kept in mind. But I'm going to rest on this slide for some time now because I think that the whole resilience story really comes through through this smattering of or collection of stories that we worked on. Okay, so it starts off with two guys, Firoz Sidhwa and his business partner Rustam Sidhwa, back in 1922. And literally the guiding line or the guiding principle behind the starting of Bharat was someone coming and telling the founder that India does not need any more doctors or engineers. We have all lawyers. We have enough of those. What we need is manufacturing. What we need is production. I know how to make tiles. Here's the mechanism. Go start your own tiling company. That's how these two young fellows, trained as lawyers, decided to get into tiling. They had the space in the family. Across the harbor, they had a factory shed. That's where they started. But more importantly, these two, Rustam and Feroz Sidhwa, were lifelong partners. Whatever they did in the next 58 years, whatever companies they started, they'd always done this together. Interesting, the first time they actually pivot is during World War II. We've heard a lot of stories about World War II from morning, but surprise, surprise, it affects the small Parsi tiling company in India. Now what happens is, during the war, since we are a British colony, a lot of the industrial manufacturing had to be diverted towards supporting the English war, or the British war. Therefore, there was a cap on the amount of cement that you can use. There was rationing, there was quota, and suddenly the Bharat Tiling Company that only uses cement, there was no cement to work with. But there was no way the Parsi family was going to fold up the factory. There was no way they were going to lay off their workers, so they had to figure out a way to keep the workers' jobs in spite of the situation, and so they started several other companies. They started a metal printing company, they teamed up with Norton and started a grinding wheel company. So at that level, they're doing all of these things just so that the tiling company or the tiling factory doesn't need to close down. And this is something that you see repeatedly happening in Bharat. For instance, let's come to Tehmeena Sidhwa. Now, Tehmeena Sidhwa, unfortunately for her, she was at the head of things. She is one of the founders' wives. This particular gentleman, Feroz Sidhwa, because he worked in a cement factory for so long, had developed some lung issues and passed away very early. And for most periods of time, he was away from the factory, although he handled production. And therefore, Tehmeena Sidhwa, his wife, had a fair understanding of the business because she kind of handled her husband's correspondence, handled a lot of the business-related work. So when he passed away, Tehmeena comes in. But unfortunately for Tehmeena, she comes in at a time when luxury products in India are very difficult to sell. In Bombay and in other metro cities, no one is building their own homes. They're all, so the trend back then was housing complexes, 3-storied, 4-storied structures, colonies like we call it. And therefore, the homeowner has no say in the kind of material that goes into his house. It is the responsibility of the builder to put in the materials, and the builder is obviously going for the cheapest material. That's where Bharat loses out, and for about 30 or 40 years, it sees a terrible, terrible time. And Tehmeena is at the head of things. She's too old to, grab the bull by its horns. She's just somehow trying to keep the company afloat. But the reason why her story, and the reason why I put out her story, was that, because of whatever the sensibility, because she chose to do that, because she put in that effort. She's a Parsi, but she was born and brought up in Germany, so she knew German more than any other Indian language. But here she was, she had to talk to the local workers in Marathi. She had to negotiate with them in Marathi. So at the age of 70, Tehmeena Sidhwa and her grandson remembers that she had the Marathi alphabet poster in her room because she realized she really needs to learn the language. And that is what I thought was most striking about Tehmeena, the kind of impact she's had on her grandson. The very fact that her grandson remembers her like that, someone who put in that effort at that age to ensure that she could still communicate with workers, for some reason, somehow, instilled the grandson with a lot of pride. And we'll come to the next generation and the grandson and how this impacts them. But moving to the next generation, now Tehmeena's daughter, Dilnawaz. So, with each person, we did a couple of stories. It's not like we did one profile story on all of them. We took their life stories and we did like perhaps 3-4 stories per person. So in the case of Dilnawaz, she comes in the 80s. She's very hands-offish. Her mother's looking after the business. She's not very keen on sort of, coming into the business. But suddenly, after her mother's death, she's been asked by the family that enough is enough. It's time we fold up this business, sell off the property or use the property, to gain rent. And again, she's not somebody who is inclined to do that. A company started by her father, looked into by her mother, doesn't want to sort of sell it off. So that's when, when she's going on this survey, looking at these various factories, seeing what has survived, seeing how much rent it can fetch her, she discovers the old design molds, the metal molds and stencils discarded in some corner of the factory. She finds these and something happens to her. She tries and gets in touch with all her father's colleagues from the 60s who will be able to tell her how to use these molds. Because please understand, by 1999, there's nobody in the factory who even knows how to use these old stencils. By then, production has moved on to, from designer intricate tiles, it's moved on to very classic terrazzo tiles. No expertise required in that. Some of the designs that you see earlier, nobody knows how to make those. Nobody knows how to use these hydraulic presses. So she goes back, hunts these people down, understands how to do it, and she experiments. 1999, she puts up a little stall at the first ever arts festival in Bombay, and something happens because suddenly the architects in Bombay realize that this is a product, especially the conservation architects, they realize that this is a product that they can use in their conservation projects. 1990s is also a time where in Bombay and in India, heritage reconstruction is suddenly becoming cool. She's out there with her tiny stall showing 5 designs, and then suddenly the conservation architects start, come in and ask her, can you do this for me? This is a project I am working on. Can you replicate these styles? And from there on is a different story in Bharat. Just that tiny act. When Firdaus comes in, her son, that's about 2008 or so, by then Dilnawaz realizes that there is opportunity here and tells Firdaus that it's your job now to make this a profitable company. So we have Firdaus, who's about in his early 30s. Not an easy place for him to be in, and that's where I start sort of empathizing with these 3rd generation, 4th generation founding families. There's one thing that guides Firdaus throughout, and that is, this company can't close down under me. I will do whatever it takes. It was started by my grandfather. My grandmother worked in it. My mother worked for it. It can't shut down because of me. And it's with just that motivation that Firdaus is able to turn it around. He himself is an eccentric, restless Parsi man. And I don't know whether you know the type, but they are a type. And he can't, every 2 months he needs to do something. And that is where the history of, or the recent history of collaborations come in. So he starts collaborating with architects, telling architects that, hey, you want a design? Show me a sketch of it. I'll try and see whether I can make that design. And which is why today they have about 500 designs. They've partnered with designers. They've partnered with they've partnered with interior designers, and they've partnered with random product designers just so that a new lexicon of design can be made available in the post-2000 customer base that Bharat deals with. We also did a few pieces on the workers, because that's something that I wanted to do very often with luxury brands. The focus is, like I said, the focus is not on the people, the focus is not on the workers, and I wanted to correct that. So we did a few pieces on the workers. In the archive, we found this one note from 1943, where this gentleman had put down his very first day in Bharat and what he saw. So that was a standalone piece that we did. We also spoke to, like I said, we also spoke to designers and architects that Bharat collaborated with. And we found Albert Millet in the archive, not someone the company knew about. In fact, they did not know they had these foreign collaborations, but it turns out in the Times of India, there were several pieces on him, an interview, critique of some of the work that he had designed. Again, he was a German design consultant who in the 1930s, like a lot of Jewish Germans, found their way to India, collaborated with industry, both manufacturing as well as the film industry. He was around for quite some time. We also have an idea of what are the buildings that he worked on. So these were, again, some of the nuggets that we were able to share with the people. And finally, like I said, we also worked with their marketing and their current teams today, from whom we understood what is it that, I mean, here we went, it was not so much the study of the brand or what the company did, but how the market evolved. For instance, sales guys who joined in different cities like Hyderabad, Madras, Bangalore, were able to tell us how in the last 25 years since liberalization, the consumer has changed, the market has changed. It's no longer today about having an Oriental or a very, very European-looking home. It's no longer about those intricate designs, but suddenly the consumer today wanted young designs, brighter colored, sometimes minimalistic. So that's an understanding they were able to give me from the ground. And those were also stories that we built in. And when we were doing that, we were able to say a lot of end user stories. So a lot of stories about how someone designed their homes and so on, and why they designed their homes. I'll go to that slide over here, for instance. You'll see all of this. Now, we found Adya Shah's mother, so that is Adya Shah's Anuradha Shah, if I'm not wrong. We found her on Instagram. Adya, her daughter, had put up this picture. I noticed the tiles, because that's what I do these days. I notice flooring, I see patterns. And I was like, who is this? Where does she live? Is this a Bharat floor? I knew the design was Bharat. So we got in touch with her. And she spoke to us about her home, and that's what we were able to tap into. We were able to, through the brand, tap into the nostalgia of home, your childhood, your space. So those were a lot of the pieces. Like I said, 100 Years, 100 Stories was just one of the exercises that we did. It was digital exercise to begin with. Now we are converting that into a book. We also had traveling exhibitions which could go to different cities that Bharat was expanding into. And we also did various creative collaborations. This is what, this is the traveling exhibition. This was called BFT's Cabinet of Curiosities. We put in all kinds of curios in it, and it traveled to 3 or 4 different locations once once the lockdown was lifted. We also realized that we don't talk to children enough in the corporate sector. And somebody pointed out to me that, the children are perhaps closest to tiles. So let's try and do something with them. And we collaborated with the museum in the city, and we had a whole lot of games where they reinterpreted childhood games with Bharat tiles. You'll see a rabbit over there. That's the kind of designs that today Bharat does. Like, see the rabbit, the flowers. These are, in my opinion, I don't know who's buying these, but it's there. And Firdaus has created an environment. Bharat today has room to experiment with design, with a different language in design, simply because it has been able to adapt itself. Finally, the last slide. 3 reasons why I think Bharat survived. Because it's a family-run business, there's just that sentimentality towards the brand, that this was started by my family, by my father. I will not let it go. Then there is also this thing about the fact that what helps is that these cement tiles have survived. Our research showed that there were several buildings from the 20s and 30s where the flooring was intact, right? And that, although that's not something today's generation wants, they want to be able to change things every couple of years, it was still worth saying that story of durability. So therefore, quality, becomes a very, very important aspect to their story. And finally, of course, we've seen that in the case, during the war, we've seen that in the 2000s with Firdaus, the fact that you recognize that things are changing around you and you choose to change with it. Let's not forget that there were several other brands in India that did similar stuff, but they all closed down by the 60s or 70s. None of those flooring companies exist in India today. So that's just what I'm going to end with. So again, for me, it was a story of resilience, and therefore I thought this was perfect to sort of tell you about in this conference.
Great, thank you so much.